I want to talk about the bedrock of history that demonstrates why Christians have historical certainty about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, these historical facts are not things that historians dispute. They are things that historians believe to be true. And so, the first of these facts is that indeed Jesus Christ was crucified. The reality is that multiple independent Christian and non-Christian sources from the first century talk about the fact that Jesus Christ was crucified on a cross. That alone disproves Islam, because Islam teaches that Christ was not crucified. Ladies and gentlemen, correct. Muslims don't believe that Christ was crucified, but everything in history teaches us that Christ was crucified, thus disproving Islam and showing the author of the Quran to be in error and to be wrong, showing that the Quran is not from God. Why do we know that Christ was crucified? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Josephus, Suetonius, and multiple other sources, including Paul, all show that Christ was crucified, and they were not all Christian. Jesus Christ was buried in a tomb. I'm not going to repeat the arguments of the last talk. Just go back and look at the last talk that JC will hopefully put up in sequence, so you'll have access to that talk before you listen to this talk. But Christ was buried in a tomb. That itself demonstrates that the Quranic story is a lie. Why? Because if some fictional character was crucified, someone other than Jesus was crucified, then that means that that body must still be in the tomb. There must still be a body in the tomb, because the evidence says that the crucified body was buried, which means that when Christians went around proclaiming the resurrection, all that the Jewish authorities had to do to disprove the claim was to go to the tomb, take out the body, and drag the rotting corpse through the streets, humiliating the Christians and proving that Christ was still dead. But they didn't do that. The reality is that from the very beginning, the only counter-narrative that was ever offered to the fact that Christ had risen from the dead by the opponents of the Christians was that the body was stolen. But if the only counter-narrative to the resurrection was that the body was stolen, it is an admission by the enemies of the Christians that the tomb was empty. And so, based upon the indisputable fact of the buried body of Jesus and the indisputable fact of the empty tomb, we can conclude that Islam is false, that the mythicists are wrong, that the Gnostics are wrong. The next indisputable fact, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd invite you to come a bit closer. Please come in a bit closer. The next indisputable fact, ladies and gentlemen, not denied even by skeptical scholars of the Christian church, historians like Dr. Bart Ehrman, they all agree that after the death of Jesus, the first followers of Jesus were in despair. Their promises, their beliefs about Jesus had been dashed. Their hopes that he was the Messiah had been thrown into the bin. They were in despair that they had believed that this man was the Messiah who was going to change the world, and yet here he is, dead and buried. No one disputes that. The evidence is clear that the first Christians were in despair at the death of Jesus. The fourth indisputable fact that I've already touched upon is that multiple sources show that the tomb of Jesus was indeed empty. And Roman sources demonstrate that it was normal to bury the bodies of the punished. Even Josephus recognizes that burying bodies was normal prior to 70 AD. Therefore, it is no small thing that the tomb of Christ was empty. The question that I challenge you and you and you and you at the back and you at the back and you to answer is, why was the tomb empty? No one disputes that it was. So the question you must answer for yourself is, why was the tomb empty? The fifth indisputable fact, ladies and gentlemen, was that the first Christians came to believe sincerely and truthfully in their hearts that Christ had risen from the dead. Now let me ask you this question. What would convince you that a man that you knew was buried, a man that you knew was dead, a man that you knew where his grave was, had risen from the dead? What would convince you? The obvious answer is that you have to see it with your own eyes. And who can blame you? Such a claim is extraordinary, and only seeing it with your own eyes would convince you. And the first apostles said exactly this, that we have seen with our own eyes that this man you crucified has risen from the dead. Ladies and gentlemen, no one disputes that Christians died for this belief. Paul, Peter, James, Stephen, and the other apostles died because of their conviction that Jesus had risen from the dead.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, certainly, sir. Bear with me. Let me land on this point, then you can ask a question. They went on to proclaim that Christ was crucified, that he died and he rose on the third day. We know that liars make poor martyrs. Ask yourself this question. Let us presume that you spin a lie, and this lie makes you rich and famous. And then the government comes to you and says, stop spreading the lie, or we'll blow your brains out with a gun at point blank range. If you had the choice between stop saying something that you knew was a lie, or continuing the lie and dying, which would you do? Every rational human being does not die for a lie. But yet we know the apostles did die for their proclamation. So your question.
Who was the first one who wrote the New Testament?
So, I'm going to answer the brother's question, and then I'm going to continue with the next point of my presentation. I would ask you to be patient, don't interrupt. But in answer to his question, The first writer of any page of the New Testament was the Apostle Paul. And he wrote his letters to churches that already existed, including churches that he did not found, like the Church of Rome, which was not a church that he founded. Someone else founded the Church of Rome, but Paul wrote to that church. And he wrote to that church based upon their common belief in the resurrection. So now let me continue with my presentation. You can ask after I've continued with my presentation. The sixth indisputable point, ladies and gentlemen, is that the first apostles were transformed by their encounter with the resurrection of our Lord. The fact that they encountered the resurrection of our Lord meant that they did what they did not have a paradigmatic matrix to do. There was no paradigmatic matrix, a cultural norm in first century Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, to say that one man had risen from the dead. The normative thing to do when someone great died is to do exactly what we do today. When you go to St. Paul's Church and you see the mausoleum to Nelson and you see the mausoleum to Wellington, great men had tombs built for them, just as referenced in the Gospel when Christ recognized that the Jews had built tombs and venerated tombs to the older prophets. In other words, when Jesus died, the normative thing to do would have been to reverence his tomb. But the first Christians did not do that. The first Christians proclaimed the resurrection. In other words, they were transformed by the experience. Something transformed them. And my question to you, please guys, don't give the troll attention. Ignore the troll. He is feeding on your attention. If you ignore him, he will go away. If you engage with him or look at him, he feeds on your attention. Ignore the troll. So the question to you is, why were the first apostles transformed when there was no cultural reason for them to be transformed if Christ had not risen from the dead? Now you can ask a question. Go on.
You are repeating what Paul said, because there are a lot of sects that were disbelieving in Paul.
What's your question?
My question was, who wrote the New Testament?
So,
I know it's Paul.
what's your question, sir? I have a presentation. Ask your question.
You are repeating.
Last chance.
Yeah, you are repeating what Paul's saying.
Okay.
But the early Christians, the early one who were with Jesus, they weren't believing in Paul.
So, ladies and gentlemen,
He was a pagan Jew.
let me bounce off what this interrupter is trying to say. So let me bounce off the non-question. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul wrote, Paul was not the first Christian. Historically, it is not disputed amongst historians that Paul was a persecutor of the church. He persecuted a body of people who believed that Christ had risen from the dead before he converted. So in other words, as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul himself quotes a creed of the early church that predates him in a letter that he writes to the Corinthian church, as he does proclaim the resurrection in the epistle to the Romans, a church that believed in the resurrection that he did not found. Christians believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ before Paul. And so, ladies and gentlemen, my heckler is simply wrong. Paul did not invent the resurrection. He came to believe in the resurrection. And what is interesting, ladies and gentlemen, is why did Paul come to believe in the resurrection?
Delusion.
In the book of Acts, it is recorded in 3 places that Paul saw the risen Jesus. In his own letters to the Galatians, he writes that he had seen the risen Jesus. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if Paul had not seen the risen Jesus, he would not have proclaimed the risen Jesus. He persecuted the church because they proclaimed the risen Jesus, and he went on to proclaim the same because he himself had witnessed the risen Jesus.
Schizophrenic.
Why is it important?
Barnabas disagree with him.
Why is it important that Jesus, that an enemy of the church, went on to proclaim the gospel?
To change and
It's-
new creed.
Why is it important? It is like Joe Biden saying, I've decided to endorse Trump for president. That would be an earth-shaking change of mind. Paul persecuted the church, and then he went to proclaim the same truth that the church proclaimed. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, when you hear Muslims say that Paul invented Christianity, they are lying and they are arguing against all the evidence. Because all the evidence is unanimous, Paul was a persecutor of the church for proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
He's an apocalyptic Jew.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an indisputed fact of history.
It's not a fact.
Ladies and gentlemen, any other questions before I move on to my next point?
Yeah. Did he suffer from mental illness?
So the question is, ladies and gentlemen, did Paul suffer from a mental illness? If you present a hypothesis, it is on you to simply present the evidence.
Correct.
So my argument for you is, if you're going to suggest Paul had a mental illness, present your evidence to the claim. Christians, however, do not base their belief upon simply Paul's testimony. We base it on Peter's testimony, on Mary's testimony, on Thomas's testimony, on Bartholomew's testimony, on Judas's testimony, on the sons of Thunder's testimony, and all the apostles who saw that Christ was risen and who proclaimed the resurrection before Paul proclaimed the resurrection. And so even if we admit the argument that Paul was suffering from a mental illness, how does that account for the other witnesses to the resurrection?
Good question.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to press on with my point before I take another question.
Alright. Charlie, you gotta read it there. Yeah.
It's not my fault that some people can't follow an argument.
Mass
The seventh
psychosis.
indisputable evidence to the resurrection
There, lads.
is that
Greek psychosis.
the resurrection was the central message of the early church. We find in the book of Acts repetitions of the sermons of the church,
Cult of Jesus.
church sermons that were preached by the apostles before Paul in an oral tradition proclaiming the resurrection, and thus demonstrating that historically speaking, the resurrection was the central message of the first Christians. Why would a Jewish community proclaim that Christ was resurrected when they had no cultural reason to do so? There was no paradigmatic model in first century Second Temple Judaism to state that Christ, a single man, had been raised from the dead. There was no expectation of this belief in that Jewish culture. It was there in the Old Testament, for sure, but the Jews of the time had misread their Old Testament and had not expected that a single man might rise from the dead, let alone believe that the Messiah would have died on the cross. And so, when Christ rises from the dead, he breaks open a new paradigmatic model that did not exist in his own cultural milieu, and that in itself is evidence to the reality experienced by the apostles. Any questions before I go on?
What is a paradigmatic model? What's that?
So a paradigmatic model or a paradigmatic matrix is simply the normative expectations of your culture. For example, if someone walked through this street right now and started saying to us that they had the cure to AIDS, what would be your first gut reaction? What?
I'll ask him.
You would ask him. Would you be skeptical?
Yeah.
Yes, that is a paradigmatic cultural model. If someone walked through this street with a Nazi flag and said that white people were superior to every other race, how would you respond?
I disagree with him
You would disagree with him. Why?
because it's wrong.
Because you have a paradigmatic cultural model. Incidentally, I would agree with you. If you were in a field and you saw an illuminous object in the shape of a saucer floating across the sky and it shot up into space straight up like a rocket, what would be your first thought about what you have seen? What?
Can you repeat the question?
If you were in a farmer's field in the dead of night and you saw a flying saucer floating across a field, and then it shot vertically straight up like a rocket but with no propulsion, what would you assume that you've seen?
UFO.
A UFO. Why? Because that is a paradigmatic cultural model. Well, what I'm saying to you is in first century Judaism, there was no paradigmatic cultural model for the idea that the Christ would be crucified and rise from the dead. It was there in the Old Testament, but the Jews had not read their Old Testament in that way. And so when Christ was crucified and rose from the dead, that was against the expectations.
You know what the Jews read, did you?
So I'm going to go on with my presentation. I'm going to go on with my presentation and I'm going to go on with my presentation and then, listen, I'm going to go on with my presentation and then I'll let you ask a question. So he's asked a question, I'm going to go on with my presentation, then you can ask a question. I'm going to talk about one more point and then I'll take a question. Well, I don't know, maybe 5-10 minutes. Right, so the next indisputable fact. You see, a lot of people are just spoilt children. They have no sense of containing themselves. If you don't meet their needs right now, they walk off like children. So, in terms of the resurrection,
I just asked you a question.
in terms of the resurrection, the disciples proclaimed the resurrection in Jerusalem where Jesus Christ had been crucified. Now think about this for a moment. When Christ had been crucified, he had been crucified publicly in front of witnesses who had been in Jerusalem, and they had witnessed the crucifixion. So if Christ had not risen from the dead, all that the people, the witnesses of that time would have had to do is to say, no, we've seen that Christ was crucified, and we'll go to the tomb and we'll show you the body. Now, the fact that the Gospels recognize that an alternative theorem was presented, that Christ's body had been stolen, demonstrates the fact that in the first century, everyone agreed that Christ was crucified and Christ was buried. Because the argument was, you've stole the body. But that's an admission that the tomb was empty. And that tradition continues. It wasn't just recorded in the Gospels, it's also recorded in the Church Fathers, who also state that even in their time, a century later, the Jews were still saying that the body of Jesus had been stolen. And both of these hypotheses emerged from Jerusalem. Both of these arguments emerged from Jerusalem. So for centuries, your choice was to believe in the resurrection or to believe that the body was stolen. And this is why the resurrection disproves Islam. Because Islam says that Christ was not crucified, only someone who looked like Christ. Well, if someone who looked like Christ was crucified, what happened to that man's body? Where did that man's body go? Answer me that, Muslims. Okay. Do you have another question before I press on? So I've been talking for a while, and at different points I've had a larger crowd, where the presentation is long and lots of people have understandably walked on to listen to other presenters. So now I'm just going to do this for the microphone, for you guys that are watching on camera. The ninth indisputable fact of the resurrection is that as a result of the preaching of the resurrection, the Christian movement began to grow. It was born. It was grown. Microphones, speaking to thousands, bro. Thousands. So, in terms of the fact that this proclamation of the resurrection went out into the world, many thousands of people came to believe in the resurrection as a fact. They came to believe in the resurrection of a fact. Now, why was that? There was born another Jewish movement within Judaism that was proclaiming that Christ was the Messiah, that Christ had died, that Christ was risen, and that Christ was coming again. It was a Jewish movement. Christians went to the temple in Jerusalem. They went to the synagogues around the Jewish diaspora as part of the Jewish people. And this Jewish movement was born unexpectedly without any cultural reasons within the Jewish world. Why? Because of the resurrection. It's the only explanation to the birth of this movement. There is no other reason to believe in the resurrection apart from its birth, apart from its preaching, apart from its transformative power, apart from its explanatory power of the empty tomb, apart from the fact that the first Jewish Christians did exactly the opposite of what you would expect a first century Jew to do when someone had died. Those of you who deny the resurrection must answer the question, what explains these facts? What hypothesis, what argument can you present that explains these facts? And if you cannot give a hypothesis that explains these facts, then the resurrection remains the only standable, the only possible, the only probable answer to the question. The 10th indisputable fact is that because of the resurrection, Jews who had their entire lives honored the Sabbath, the Saturday, as a holy day, went on to add the Sunday, the first day of the week, as a holy day, a day in which they gathered together in houses to break bread and to drink wine, ceremoniously proclaiming the crucifixion and the resurrection and the return of Christ. Now think about this for a moment. If Christ had merely died, then the memorial of his supper would have only been a memorial of his crucifixion. But the memorial of his supper proclaims the resurrection. It assumes the resurrection because it is celebrated on the first day of the week, the Sunday, the day when Christians say that Christ rose from the dead. Why would Jews honor the most common of days, the first day of the week, as something special, unless something special had happened to make that day special to them? It makes no sense. Show me why in the Old Testament any Jew would have treated Sunday as a special day. There is no reason for it. There is no justification for it. But something changed a group of Jews into honoring the Sunday as the first day as a special day of celebration, even though paradigmatically they had no reason to do so. And that shift, that cultural change, can only be explained by the resurrection. And if you think I'm wrong, then you explain to me why the Jews changed their day of special celebration to a Sunday. What reason do you want to give to explain that? My next and final point as to why we as Christians believe that the resurrection is the best probable answer to all the historical evidence is that it is not disputed amongst historians that James, the brother of Jesus, was a convert to the Christian faith and was a leader of the early church. James, the brother of Jesus, is recorded in the Gospels as being skeptical of his brother's claims. They assumed that because our Lord was making these outlandish claims, that he was Lord of the Sabbath, that he was existent before David, that he was the resurrection and the life, that he was the good shepherd, that he was the great I am, that he was the bread from heaven, that he was the one who was Emmanuel, the fulfillment of the prophecies of Isaiah, that he was the one whom a great prophet like John the Baptist, fulfilling the role of Elijah, had been prophesied, and fulfilling that role as the divine figure that would come, the embodiment of the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7, They assumed that he was ill, that he was mad. But yet this skeptic, James, the brother of Jesus, became one of the pillars of the church in Jerusalem. So my question to all of you skeptics, all of you who deny the resurrection, explain to me what changed James's mind. Why did he go from doubting to believing? Why did he go from opposing to following? Why did he go from dismissing to being a leader of the church? In conclusion, I have presented to you 11 historical, indisputable facts of history that are connected and explained by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. You, if you doubt the resurrection of Jesus Christ, must present to me an explanation that accounts for these 11 facts, not separate explanations for each one, but one explanation that can account for all 11 facts. And if you cannot present to me one explanation that accommodates these 11 facts, then the best and most probable explanation is that indeed Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Christos anesti. Christ is risen. Peace be with you, sister.